This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. Dominance in motorsports. It seems like every major racing series these days is either in, or has just come out of, a period of sustained dominance. Be it Max Verstappen and Red Bull's current stranglehold on Formula 1, Marc Marquez and Repsol Honda's previous domination of MotoGP, or Sébastien Ogier's 8 World Rally Championships, a single competitor absolutely crushing their opposition is nothing new in the modern era. And that's not to take anything away from them, because periods like these simply don't happen by accident. It's just that, from a viewer's perspective, the fact that you can bring together the greatest minds and most talented individuals within a specific discipline, and then watch as one group makes the rest look completely out of their depth with almost uniform predictability, is kind of absurd. Especially so when you consider the amount of variables that are often at play. In Formula 1 alone, since the turn of the millennium, there has been 4 separate periods of sustained dominance from 4 different drivers racing for 3 different teams. The late Murray Walker once said, "Anything happens in Grand Prix racing, and it usually does." Unfortunately, anything can also include nothing of interest. Anyway, despite all of this, you'd be hard-pressed to find many people within the F1 sphere calling for systems to specifically handicap the fastest teams and drivers. It would dilute the purity of the sport, some may say. But what if there were a racing series where the competition and unpredictability was put on an almost equal level with the meritocracy? The idea that the best should always be at the top. Well, we don't have to wonder because that series already exists. And it's called Super GT. Super GT, previously known as the All Japan Grand Touring Car Championship, has always been very public about its commitment to providing exciting racing first and foremost before anything else. And how they go about achieving this takes many forms. Firstly, in terms of the cars themselves, the use of many standardized parts is mandated. This is to prevent manufacturers from investing large sums of money into developing their cars and creating gaps in the competitive order. Other methods are more direct, however, such as the use of success ballast, adding weight to the cars for each point they score in the championship. In the top GT500 class, since 2017, the cars have even been given fuel restrictors which reduce their engine power. Regardless of if you agree with all of this, the impact cannot be denied. You would be very hard-pressed to find a Super GT race which could be described as predictable or boring. In fact, the unpredictability of the series has almost, in and of itself, become predictable. So, with all of that said, you might think that total domination would be almost impossible, right? Well, yes, but with the emphasis on almost. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of this series' most crushing championship season, and the one key person who was central to all of it. Their story is one of success, celebration, sadness, and tragedy. Even if you know practically nothing about Super GT or the JGTC, there's still a very good chance that you would have seen this car before. This is the 1997 Toyota Castrol Supra run by Team Toms. Not only because it's on the thumbnail of my most popular video, but also because it was the 1997 GT500 champion car, driven by a certain Pedro Della Rosa and Michael Krum, that would give Toyota their first ever GT500 title. The car would then go on to be immortalized in the most successful racing game franchise of all time, and the rest is history. But the legacy of Team Toms of course extends much further than this singular car. They've raced in the JGTC since almost the very beginning, and along with their first success in 1997, have gone on to win the GT500 title on 5 more occasions. Toms was formed in 1974 by former racing driver Nobuhide Tachi and a Toyota car dealer Kiyoshi Oiwa. Toms actually stands for Tachi Oiwa Motorsports. Rumour has it that the M was supposed to stand for the name of a third founder who eventually pulled out, but this has never been officially confirmed. Toms originally started as a tuning shop for Toyota models, but soon expanded into motorsport. Tachi was a fairly successful driver, winning the Fuji 1000 km in 1975 and winning at the famed Macau street circuit in both 1974 and 75. He retired from driving at the end of 1982, after which he focused his efforts on managing Toms. But it wouldn't take long before he'd be called back into the world of racing. His son, Shingo Tachi, emerged as a promising talent in the early 90s. In 1994, at the age of 16, Shingo Tachi moved to the UK to continue his studies and compete in the Formula Vauxhall Junior Championship. He spent 2 seasons there, scoring decent results, but this was mostly a phase of learning for him. In 1996, he stepped up to the British Formula 3 Championship. Previously, in 1987, Toms had expanded into Europe with a base in the UK that produced engines specifically for F3. Tachi would be backed by Toms throughout his tenure in British F3, which lasted just the 1996 season. Despite this, he performed solidly, narrowly missing out on the B-Class Championship. Regardless, his studies in the UK had finished, and he returned to Japan for 1997, racing in the Japanese F3 Championship for Team Toms. He scored 2 podiums and finished 6th in the championship. For 1998, he would be joined by Peter Dumbreck at the team, the man best known for doing this the following year.
Here we go. Oh my god, the Mercedes has taken off. That's Peter Dumbreck at the wheel of the number 5 Mercedes.
But before that, he'd won the British F3 Championship in 1997, and, as Tachi's teammate, would do the same in Japanese F3 in 1998. The two would become good friends, with Dumbreck later naming Tachi as his favourite ever teammate. Tachi himself scored 5 podiums during that 1998 season, on his way to 3rd in the standings. He would also finish 13th overall on his first trip to Macau, where his father had won more than 2 decades prior. Outside of single-seaters, Tachi would also compete in the N1 Endurance Series for modified production cars, again with Toms. He partnered Shingo Morao and would go on to win in class at the blue-ribboned 24 Hours of Takeuchi in 1997, at the wheel of a Toyota Celica GT4. When Tachi moved to the UK earlier in his career, he wasn't entirely alone. He was part of a new crop of up-and-coming Japanese drivers trying to make a name for themselves in Europe. One of those other drivers was Takashi Yokoyama. Yokoyama also competed with Toms in British F3 in 1996, and just like Tachi, would move to Japanese F3 for 1997. But in the penultimate round of the Japanese F3 season at Fuji Speedway, Yokoyama's teammate, Shigekazu Wakisaka, and Tachi's teammate, Tom Coronel, were involved in a scary accident on the first lap. They both walked away without injury, but this accident brought out the safety car. Yokoyama, who started back in 17th place, continued at full speed trying to catch up to the back of the pack. Not realizing that the cars ahead had slowed down so much, he collided with one of the cars in front at roughly 160 miles an hour, launching his car 5 meters into the air, where it would collide directly with the overhead gantry and disintegrate on impact. Yokoyama did not survive. This was one of the most violent accidents in Japanese racing history, and served as a timely reminder of the ever-present danger in the sport. At this point, Tachi had demonstrated his abilities in both single-seaters and touring cars, but just 1 month after Yokoyama's fatal accident, he would get an unexpected opportunity. As I mentioned, Toms won their first GT500 title in 1997 with Pedro Della Rosa and Michael Krum. However, after the season, there was a special all-star race at the newly built twin-ring Motegi circuit. The issue for Toms was that seemingly neither driver were actually contracted for this race. Della Rosa moving on to Formula 1 as a test driver for Jordan, and Krum defecting over to Nissan. This meant that they needed 2 new drivers for the number 36 car. One of those would end up being Ukyo Katayama, fresh off his tenure in Formula 1. The second would be Masanori Sekiya. However, Sekiya normally raced the number 37 Tom Supra, so that now left a vacancy for that car. This vacancy would be filled by Shingo Tachi. Now, one would imagine that there was some amount of nepotism at play here, given his dad ran the team, and his results up until this point were decent but not outstanding. He had also never raced a car as big and as powerful as the GT500 Supra before. But on the other hand, given that it was an off-season race that didn't count towards anything, and the Motegi Oval with pylon chicanes would be completely new to everyone, it would be the perfect opportunity to give him a run and potentially impress any other teams that were looking for a driver. The event took place over 2 heats, with the number 37 car starting from 3rd place at the hands of Toshio Suzuki. Tachi took over at half race distance, and despite locking up and spinning through one of the chicanes, had a relatively uneventful run to maintain 3rd until the finish. In the second heat, Suzuki would again start the car with Tachi taking over partway through, but it was the number 38 Castrol Tsurumo Supra, which started 1 place ahead of them, that would lock up and spin at the same chicane. This elevated the number 37 car to 2nd, which Tachi would hold onto right to the flag. It was a very mature drive for someone who had only just turned 20 years old, as far more experienced drivers were losing their head on this unusual circuit. This performance would undoubtedly have turned a few heads in the paddock at the time. Heading into 1998, Tachi would race for Toms in F3, but was also courted by Tsuchiya Engineering to race their Toyota MR2 in the GT300 class of JGTC. He would be joined by veteran Keiichi Suzuki, a former Toms driver himself in touring cars and sports cars, and a friend of Nobuhide. Suzuki was already a GT300 champion in 1996 with Team Taisan Jr., and would then be runner-up in 1997. At the same time that Suzuki would move to Tsuchiya, Team Taisan Jr. would also move to Tsuchiya, creating the Team Taisan Jr. with Tsuchiya Engineering outfit, which would run the number 25 Toyota MR2. Even still, the GT300 field of 1998 was pretty strong. There was another MR2 in the form of the number 44 Apex racing car, as well as many Porsche 911 993s, Nissan Silvias, and plenty more challengers. The season started off at Suzuka, where Tachi qualified the car P7, despite Suzuki having a crash in practice which set the team back. After making a slow start, Tachi quickly gained places and made it all the way up to 2nd, just behind the Apex MR2. But when the Momo-sponsored Apex car came into the pits, not enough fuel went into the car, meaning that they had to stop for a second time. So, when Tachi brought the Tsuchiya MR2 in to hand over to Suzuki, he was able to come out easily in the lead. From there, Suzuki brought the car to the finish to guarantee his 7th win in the series and Tachi's first ever on his debut in GT300. Although they made it harder for themselves than they really needed to, it was a supreme performance. Tachi's pace during the first half of the race in particular was immense. Team Tsuchiya had finished a distant 3rd in the standings the previous year with a single win, but this strong start to 1998 implied that maybe a championship challenge would be possible with their refreshed driver lineup. Still, it was just the first race of the season, so too early to get carried away just yet. Round 2 of the series was due to take place at Fuji Speedway. Tachi qualified the car in P8, but appalling conditions meant that the race would be started under the safety car. However, at the start of the second lap behind the safety car, when the grid would normally be forming up to start the race, an accident occurred in the GT300 field. The safety car staying out for another lap and the lack of visibility caused confusion. The 2 front row cars in GT300, the number 71 Sigmatech Porsche and 910 Racing Porsche, collided heavily, with the 910 car of Tomohiko Sanako ending up stranded on the grass. As his damaged car was sat stationary, further behind, Tetsuya Ota lost control of his Ferrari, slamming into the Porsche with both cars going up in flames. Sanako suffered a broken leg and minor burns, but would go on to make a full recovery. Ota, on the other hand, suffered very severe burns which would require surgery and put an end to his racing career. Not even a year after Yokoyama's horrific accident at the same venue, another major crash had occurred. Due to this accident and later the severe fog, the race was eventually cancelled entirely. The third round of the season took place at Sendai in much better conditions. Tachi had qualified the car on the front row, but once again made a poor start and dropped back to 5th. But, much like at Suzuka, showed overwhelming pace to overtake the Apex MR2, Daishin Sylvia, Zanavi Sylvia, and finally the RE Amemiya RX-7 to take the lead. After that, he cruised away from the chasing pack, at times lapping multiple seconds a lap faster than the others. And he did this despite carrying 30 kilograms of ballast owing to their victory in round 1. Once again, Suzuki took over the car for the second stint and brought it home for their second win of the season. The championship was now very much on the cards. For round 4, the series returned to Fuji Speedway. The Tsuchiya MR2 would now be weighed down with 60 kilograms of success ballast. Surely at this high-speed circuit, the less powerful MR2 with its added weight would stand no chance of a third successive victory, right? Well, Tachi didn't seem to get the memo, as he put the car on pole, just barely, and then proceeded to do his usual trick of pulling away in the first stint, then handing the car over to Suzuki to bring home. 53 laps later, the duo had successfully achieved 3 wins in a row, a feat that hadn't, and to this day still hasn't, ever been achieved by any other team. And to make it all the sweeter for Tachi, one of the drivers in the much lighter Apex MR2, which had come home in second, was his F3 teammate Peter Dumbrek. Years later, Dumbrek would say in an interview that, I quote, "I was surprised at his pace, how quick he was in the car. I'm sure he felt quite good about it because I'd taken the F3 championship and he was still fairly young and still learning. But in GT, he really was very good." But the job wasn't done just yet. The 5th round of the series would take them to the Motegi road course. Would the blue MR2 take yet a 4th straight win? Well, no. And partly because it wasn't blue, it was silver. This change was made as a sort of preemptive celebration of the team winning the championship, but I like to believe that it was done as a response to onlookers who were sick of seeing the blue MR2 dominate every race. The more important difference though was that they were now saddled with the maximum 80 kilograms of ballast. Even still, Tachi again put the car on the front row of the grid behind only the very light Cusco Impreza. Sadly, he suffered another one of his almost trademark slow starts and dropped further back. At the front though, there was a thrilling battle between the Impreza and the Apex MR2, which would eventually be resolved in the Impreza's favour, after the red MR2 spun out of contention. Meanwhile, for the silver MR2, they suffered a slow stop, and combined with unfortunate timing of the safety car, meant they would come home in 6th place. Still a very decent result given the circumstances, but you have to feel like it would have been slightly disappointing given their form at the previous round with just 20 kilos less in ballast. For the 6th round of the series, they would lose 10 kilos of ballast to bring them down to 70 kg, but they would have Racing Project Bando's all-new Celica GT300 to contend with. Bando had won the GT300 title the previous year with a Nissan Silvia, but elected to skip the first 3 rounds of 1998 until it could introduce its new challenger. As such, the car had practically no ballast for round 6, which would take place at the Central Park Mine circuit. Unsurprisingly, they took pole position, with Tachi putting the Tsuchiya MR2 in second. This time, however, Tachi made a great start and stuck with the Celica. After a few laps, he saw his opportunity and dived down the inside of the Wedsport liveried car. All they had to do was achieve at least 4th place to seal the championship, but that didn't mean Tachi was taking it easy. Even after Suzuki had taken over the car and Bando had swapped to its star driver, Manabu Orido, for the final stint, they were still able to take the win by almost half a minute, thus sealing the championship with 1 race to go. The first time that such a feat had ever been achieved in the JGTC, as well as breaking another record with their 4th win of the season. Suzuki himself had achieved 3 wins during his 1996 championship campaign alongside Morio Nitta, that itself being one of the most dominant championship seasons ever, with 3 wins and 2 second places in 6 races. But 1998 had surpassed even that. Remember, this was still Tachi's first ever season in the series, and with it he became the youngest ever series champion at 21 years old. But the story of their 1998 campaign doesn't end there. Such was their dominance that they had clinched the championship still with a race to go. The final round took place at Sugo, with the Tsuchiya MR2 once again at the maximum 80 kilos of ballast. Given that the championship had already been wrapped up, and they had broken almost every record there was to break, you would have been forgiven for thinking that Tachi and Suzuki would take it easy to just close out the season. But that's not what happened. The only stain on their perfect season so far was at Motegi, where they weren't able to overcome the 80 kilos of success ballast. At Sugo, it seemed like they had a point to prove. Tachi again put the car on pole, just edging out his good friend and rival Dumbrek in the Apex MR2. For the first part of the race, Tachi held onto the lead with Dumbrek following closely behind. He encountered a slight scare as oil dropped from the number 777 Lamborghini Diablo obscured his visibility, but pressed on regardless, and after the Apex MR2 dropped out with transmission problems, found himself in an unassailable lead. Such was his lead that the team was able to pit, fully service the car with fuel and tyres, and switch drivers to Suzuki, and still come out in front. In the end, the team were victorious by almost a full lap from the second place Mitsubishi FTO. It wasn't simply a victory, it was a decimation. Tachi was already starting to pull away from Dumbrek before he retired, such was his speed. Thus bringing to an end the most dominant championship season in JGTC or Super GT history. A season that, by design, will almost certainly never be matched. You may remember from my previous video that the most successful season for Team J-Lock with their GT500 Lamborghini Diablo was in 1998, when they scored 3 points. If Tsuchiya had entered their MR2 in GT500 instead, they would have also accrued 3 points in the championship owing to their 3 10th place overall finishes. Such was their level of speed and consistency across the year. But after the season, there was an all-star race hosted, just like in 1997. The venue was TI Ida, now known as Okayama International, which was an ex-Formula 1 circuit. Finally freed from the ballast, Team Tsuchiya were now able to show what they could really do. Tachi again qualified the car on pole, more than 1.5 seconds faster than the next closest challenger. Despite spinning off early in the race and losing a lot of time, they were still able to come back and complete another crushing victory. The only caveat being that only 6 cars were entered for this race in GT300. In the championship itself, Tachi and Suzuki finished with a grand total of 106 points, a whopping 60 points more than their next closest challenger of Manabu Orido in the Bando Celica. That is 3 whole race wins worth of points, and yet again, another record that will likely never be broken. So, how was Team Tsuchiya able to be so dominant in 1998, to a degree that no other team has achieved before or since? Well, one thing we can't overlook is the car. The Toyota MR2 first appeared in GT300 in 1996. The first team to use it as a basis was Imaraya Racing, but later Tsuchiya would build their own MR2 which would debut at Sugo that same year. The car was a sort of parts bin special built from leftovers of Tsuchiya's JTCC touring cars. It actually ended up being too light, and there wasn't enough space to put any ballast, so the original doors had to be used, hence why they're black despite the rest of the car being white. Even from its humble beginnings, the car showed speed, qualifying 2nd and finishing 4th in its debut race. The car evolved even further for 1997, and after being fitted with a turbocharger, was able to achieve its first ever win in round 3 at Sendai. The drivers, Masaoki Nagashima and Takeshi Tsuchiya, the son of team founder Haruo Tsuchiya, would ultimately finish a distant 3rd in the 1997 standings. The team had always shown promise, but the 1998 season surely must have exceeded even their lofty ambitions. Part of the MR2's speed was down to its layout. It was a lightweight, mid-engine sports car. The second generation MR2 was often known to be tricky to control in its standard road car form, particularly the earlier models. But as a platform to build a race car from, where the suspension could be replaced entirely and more sophisticated aerodynamics developed, it seemed to work very well. The late team founder, Haruo Tsuchiya, once explained in an interview that one of the decisions to use the MR2 specifically was because he didn't want to enter JGTC with a front-wheel drive car. When you compare his MR2 with the Bando Celica, it becomes clear why he thought that way. The MR2 was lighter, more nimble, and better on its tyres. The Celica, despite having the front-end design from the GT4, was actually based on the front-wheel drive ST202 Celica. And whilst it did finish as the runner-up in 1998, that was as good as it ever got. It was third in 1999 and fifth in 2000, before being replaced for 2001. Front-wheel drive cars were already a rarity in GT300, but after 2001 they disappeared entirely. When Bando introduced their new car, based on the 7th generation Celica, it took the FR drivetrain from the previous GT500 Supra, as well as the same 4-cylinder engine but now detuned. The point is that it seems like Tsuchiya's decision to go with the mid-engined rear-wheel drive MR2 was the right one, and back when it raced, the MR2 was the only purpose-built midship GT300 car. If it weren't for unreliability, the Apex MR2 surely would have been runner-up in the 1998 standings also. But that then begs the question of why did the Tsuchiya MR2 perform so much better than the Apex one? Well, the obvious point is to do with the drivers, but we'll get to that in a moment. An important thing to note is that despite it looking very similar to the Tsuchiya MR2, the Apex MR2 was not the same car. They were both based on the same SW20 MR2 chassis, but after that they start to diverge. The championship-winning car was developed by Tsuchiya Engineering, and the Momo-sponsored car was done by Apex Racing, now known as APR. Now, it's hard to judge from the outside what exactly were the differences, but there were a few key things that hinted towards the Tsuchiya MR2 being just that bit better than the Apex MR2, beyond just the results, of course. First was that the Apex car was newly developed for the 1998 season, whereas the Tsuchiya car had been around since 1996, continually being improved and refined within that time. The second important difference comes down to the tyres. Despite all of the measures that have been put in place by Super GT to ensure close racing, the tyres have always been the big differentiator. In current day, Super GT is one of the few major racing series to still have an ongoing tyre war with 4 tyre makers in total: Bridgestone, Yokohama, Dunlop, and Michelin, although Michelin is sadly pulling out of GT500 for 2024. The point is that the choice of tyre maker is often one of the biggest factors in determining which cars and teams become the haves and which become the have-nots. This has been the most obvious in GT500 recently, as the teams with Bridgestone and Michelin tyres have shown a clear advantage over the few with Yokohamas or Dunlops. And if we look back to those GT300 MR2s in 1998, we can see that they both used different tyre suppliers. The Tsuchiya MR2 on Yokohamas, and the Apex MR2 on Dunlops. It's hard to say from the outside which was superior back then, but Dumbrek believes that the Tsuchiya car had the better package overall, so make of that what you will. But the fact is that Haruo Tsuchiya once stated, "I think it's close to the best masterpiece ever" when talking about his MR2. I don't think there's much higher praise than that. But now we have to mention the drivers. Of course, this video is mainly about Shingo Tachi, but we can't discount the role that Keiichi Suzuki played in this season. At the time, he was already almost 50 years old, and had endured a career where he raced a bit of everything: single-seaters, touring cars, Group C prototypes, and of course, GTs. Along with his 1996 GT300 triumph, the previous year he had even won a race in the top class of JGTC, alongside Hideshi Matsuda at the wheel of a Porsche 911 GT2. All of this was to say that he was a very talented driver in his own right, and when it came to taking Tachi under his wing, who was his junior by almost 30 years, he played the role of experienced veteran to perfection. With the exception of his crash in practice for the season opener, he barely put a foot wrong all year. But a big benefit for him was that he always did the final stint of each race. And with the exception of Motegi, whenever he took over the car, it was already in the lead, usually with a decent advantage. And that was all down to Tachi. Despite being a rookie, Tachi was given the important tasks of qualifying the car and doing the first half of the race, usually the more important half in defining the general order. His qualifying pace across the 7 starts was supreme, starting from pole on 2 occasions and second on 3 more. His race starts, as mentioned, were probably his worst area, as he routinely lost positions on the opening lap. But again, that can be forgiven granted his lack of experience when it came to rolling starts, and the fact that he almost always made up those positions again within the next few laps. As the season went on, he would gradually improve this aspect as well as he became a more complete GT driver. Regardless, his underlying speed was always clear to see, even from his one-off appearance in the Supra at the end of 1997. And that is a full breakdown of the most dominant JGTC/Super GT season that we have and probably will ever see. A truly perfect storm that came together to defy the odds and override the entire mission statement of the series. As incredible as it was, it is probably a good sign that nothing like this has ever happened again. But our story doesn't end here. You're probably wondering what happened to all parties involved after that momentous 1998 season. For Tachi, it was clear what his next step for 1999 needed to be: a full-time GT500 drive with Toyota. And fortunately, at the start of the year, that's what he got. But would it be with his father's team, who for 1999 would actually expand to field 3 cars in GT500? Well, that might seem like the logical conclusion, given his one-off appearance at Motegi in 1997, but that's not what happened. He would actually be signed by Team Le Mans. Team Le Mans weren't unknown. They already had a rich history in sports cars and single-seaters, but not so much when it came to GTs. They had previously raced in JGTC with an ex-IMSA Nissan 300ZX, but achieved very limited results before the car was retired after a practice crash at Fuji in 1997. The team then sat out the 1998 season before taking over Inging's number 6 Esso-sponsored Supra for 99. Along with Tachi, Hideki Noda was signed as the team's other driver, having raced the number 38 Tsurumo Supra the previous year, as Toyota looked to bounce back from a disappointing season where they didn't win a single race in GT500. But also, Tachi's performances in Japanese F3 didn't go unnoticed either. After finishing 3rd in the 1998 standings, he was given a test for Formula Nippon, what is now known today as Super Formula. And it seemed like he impressed, as he was offered a seat with Team TMS for the season. For 1999, still only at the age of 21, he was going into the big leagues. It would be a make or break year for him. His 1998 GT300 season had laid down a clear marker, but there were many other promising young talents coming through at the same time, like Ryo Michigami, Satoshi Motoyama, and Yuji Tachikawa to name just a few. His preparation for the upcoming season would be crucial, and so pre-season testing for both JGTC and Formula Nippon began in March. Firstly at Suzuka, and then later a private test with Toyota at TI Ida. It was this second test, which took place on the 11th of March, which would arguably change the course of Japanese racing history. At roughly 4:45 PM local time, as Tachi was preparing to start another flying lap at the wheel of his number 6 Esso Supra, his car continued straight through the gravel trap at turn 1, colliding with the tyre-lined concrete barrier at almost 155 miles an hour. He was quickly rushed to hospital, but had suffered severe injuries to his chest from the steering wheel. Despite the best efforts of medical professionals, Shingo Tachi lost his life at 5:50 PM. The cause of the accident itself is still unknown to this day. The loss of one of Japan's brightest up-and-coming drivers, and at the venue of his final ever win, sent shockwaves through the racing fraternity. The accident had occurred a mere 10 days before the start of the JGTC season. As such, when the paddock reconvened at Suzuka, it was under a very somber tone. Out of respect, Team Le Mans had decided to withdraw from the round entirely. Tachi's 1998 teammate, Keiichi Suzuki, retired from racing altogether. Such was the gravity of the loss. Something like this had seemed unthinkable just a few months prior. But time continued on, and so did the racing. There were many tributes made to Shingo Tachi. At the Le Mans 24 Hours in June, the Toyota team, racing their GT1, wished to win the race in Tachi's memory, with Ukyo Katayama, another Tom's driver, even being given Tachi's racing gloves to use. And it was with these gloves that he wrestled the GT1 back into shape after suffering a rear left tyre blowout at more than 210 miles an hour. It was his supreme reactions that prevented a much bigger accident, but some would say that divine intervention played its part on that day as well. Even though they had lost the win to BMW, they had avoided a much bigger disaster and still came home safely in second place. One could also argue that Tachi played a part in Dumbarek somehow walking away unscathed from his massive accident as well. Team Le Mans reappeared in GT500 from round 2 onwards, with former MotoGP world champion Wayne Gardner filling what would have been Tachi's seat alongside Hideki Noda. Noda would also race with Tachi's gloves during round 2 of the season. They claimed the team's first pole position in round 3 at Sugo, and would then go on to take an emotional victory at Fuji in August. A win which they would of course dedicate to Tachi. It was also reported that former Tom's driver, Pedro Della Rosa, even engraved Tachi's name onto his helmet for the Brazilian Grand Prix in honour of his memory, showing just how far-reaching the tragedy was. As for the team that Tachi really built his legacy with, Tsuchiya Engineering, they would part ways with Team Taisan for 1999. Instead, they would be supported by Apex Racing, their rivals from the previous year, and would inherit their Momo sponsorship as well. With Tachi gone and Suzuki retired, an all-new driver lineup of Morio Nitta and Shinichi Takagi was employed. Fun fact, these two are actually again teammates in the K-Tunes Racing Lexus RCF in GT300 24 years later. In 1999, they would take victory at round 2, also at Fuji Speedway, and eventually Nitta would finish as series champion, giving Tsuchiya back-to-back titles with the MR2. It was, however, a much tighter victory than the previous year, with the car then being replaced by the Toyota MRS for 2000 onwards. And if you're looking to see the record-breaking Tsuchiya MR2 in real life, then you should know that it's maintained in its 1999 Momo livery and not either of the 1998 paint schemes. That might be disappointing to find out, considering the story and record-breaking season, but to be fair, the bright orange does look better. As for Tom's, ever since Shingo Tachi's untimely passing, they've always carried a sticker with his helmet design and the words "with Shingo" on each of their GT500 race cars. Nobuhide Tachi has never spoken openly about the loss of his son, but from this, it's clear that he still matters as much to him today as he did all those years ago. What's also clear is that, despite how cruel it can be, he still loves racing, with Tom still competing and winning in both Super GT and Super Formula. They're practically Toyota's de facto works team when it comes to those two series. The story of Shingo Tachi is one of unfulfilled promise. Who knows what he could have gone on to achieve? To put it into perspective, another Toyota driver from Tachi's generation was Yuji Tachikawa. He would go on to have a long and storied career, particularly in Super GT, where he would win 3 GT500 championships and countless races. He finally retired at the end of the 2023 Super GT season, still racing in GT500 at the age of 48. If Shingo Tachi was still around today, he would be 46. Shingo Tachi is an almost completely unknown name outside of Japan, and in many ways, that's understandable. He had a very short career in a series that attracted very little international attention at the time. But what he achieved and who he was left a massive impression on those who knew him. That interview with Peter Dumbrek, where he recounts his memories of Tachi, which I've quoted a couple of times, was only published a few months ago. Yet, if you search his name on YouTube, in the Roman alphabet, you will get no results about him. He does have a Wikipedia page, but this is all it is. It's clear to me that, sadly, once the people who actually knew him personally are gone, there won't be anyone left to tell the full story of one of the most naturally talented racing drivers to never get the chance they deserved. But it's not just about his driving ability. One thing that comes across from Dumbrek's interview and various other places is that he was an incredibly likable guy. One who was always humble and never took what he had for granted, despite the clear advantages he had from his father's company. So whenever we talk about these lost talents, like Jules Bianchi or Antoine Hubert, drivers who we lost far before their peak, despite his obscurity, I believe we should also consider Tachi among them. The main reason I wanted to make this video was this. Not just to talk about my favourite racing series and this unbelievable season, but to have this record of Tachi's career and lasting legacy. Because if something like this were to happen in current day, it would probably end up being a plot to a movie. But as many people aren't familiar with the names involved, they have very little reason to care. To me, it's stories like these that make motorsport so unique. On only 3 other occasions has a team won either the GT300 or GT500 championship with a race to spare, but none have done it so convincingly as Tachi and Suzuki. As it stands, Shingo Tachi is the only driver to lose his life in a JGTC or Super GT session, and hopefully it stays that way. But still, let's just remember who he was and what he showed was possible in that incredible 1998 GT300 season.